So welcome everybody to this year's celebration of the American and French victories at Saratoga and Yorktown. The surrenders occurred on October 17th, 1777 and October 19th, 1781. The two surrenders were, although separated by 4 years, closely linked, because it was after the American victory at Saratoga that the French were convinced that it was appropriate to enter into a formal, both commercial and military alliance with the new United States, that there were prospects for success. Previously, the French had given aid surreptitiously, fooling nobody, but they had not officially become a combatant. After the French joined with the Americans, the American Revolution became a world war. It went on in the Caribbean, it went on in India, went in Spain, around England, in Europe, various other places. 4 years later, the French arrived in, well, actually earlier than 4 years, leading up to 4 years later, the French arrived in force with several thousand troops led by Comte de Rochambeau, which accompanied the American Continental troops to Virginia, trapped Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, and after a furious siege, which I may comment later, I forced the British to surrender. When I visited Yorktown some years ago, I was looking at the order of battle on a sign and remarking there were a lot of French there, were there not? About 40% of the troops, 100% of the Navy, under the Comte de Grasse, a lot of guns, brought some money to pay the troops. There are the cannons that the French brought on display at the American Revolution Museum in Yorktown. They are huge. You see Revolutionary War cannons here and there and whatnot. These are immense. I mean, they are like so high. I don't know the size of the shells, but the bombardment from the Americans and the French at Yorktown went on, several times, almost every minute something was shot at the British. It's amazing that they held out as long as they did. But what was remarkable to me, was how much the American victory was reliant upon the French assistance, both from the Navy and from the Army there. The war went on for another, well, the treaty, the preliminary articles were signed in November of 1782. There were further battles in the South. There were battles in the West. But essentially, the British lost heart after the Battle of Yorktown. They figured, this is not a winning effort on our part. The supply line is 3,000 miles long. We are not getting the support from the population that we expected. We make more money in the West Indies. Let's cast these ungrateful persons off. They'll never survive independently anyway. Let's get this over with. Usually when we start, we have previously had our celebrations at Trinity Churchyard or at St. Paul's. We usually start with the Star Spangled Banner and the Marseillaise. Today we'll end it with those anthems. I think it's appropriate for the people that are here. Do we have, Jim, you said there was a proclamation, or there's not a proclamation here? No? Okay. Is there a proclamation? Is behind me. On the table behind me. Okay. Oh, that's terrific. Thank you, Jim. Okay, from the City Council, citation. Whereas A great city is only as great as those persons who give exemplary service to their communities, whether through unique personal achievement in their professional or other endeavors, or simply through a lifetime of philanthropy and community service. Whereas such service, which is truly the lifeblood of the community and the city, so often goes unrecognized and unrewarded. Now, therefore, be it resolved that as a duly elected member of the New York City Council, I recognize that the Lower Manhattan Historical Association we have an outstanding citizens, have been our outstanding citizens on whom it is worthy of the esteem of both our community and the great city of New York. You might have noticed that I left my reading glasses in my office. But yeah, this was very nice. Thank you. This is from Council Member Carlina Rivera. Bless her. Thank you for getting that, Jim. This is good. And I will say, this is an event that's been put on by the Lower Manhattan Historical Association, organized by it. The Sons of the Revolution, as part of its constitution, is to celebrate each year the battles of Saratoga and Yorktown. And we are fortunate to do that in collaboration with the Lower Manhattan Historical Association, which was begun by one of the guides of our tours, Jim Kaplan, who, is here. I think initially, I was supposed to talk about Horatio Gates, who is known. Can you hear me? We have pictures? Okay, good. All right. Do this. What happens here? What do I get? Oh, that, okay. Oh, look, okay. Well, we have a welcome and introduction. Hey, that's my name there. Terrific. So we have a couple of pictures here. One, the first picture, this is a painting by John Trumbull. I think this is in the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, of John Burgoyne surrendering to Horatio Gates. Now, this was, let's face it, it was a surrender. This was the first surrender of a British army to Americans like anywhere. This was 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers who were surrendered. Now, Gates, being a cordial gentleman toward General Burgoyne, characterized the surrender as a convention whereby the British troops would be allowed to go back to England. Congress said nothing doing. They're not going back to England. They're staying here. So this became known as the Convention Army, which was marched up to Boston and then marched down to Charlottesville, Virginia, where they stayed with a bit of leakage over the years until the end of the war. The picture at the bottom, this is the assault on, I guess, probably Redoubt 10. We'll get to that with Elizabeth Kaplan, where she's talking about, the Battle of Yorktown. This is one of the penultimate attacks before the British surrendered, and it rendered their position untenable. We have another picture. Oh, this is, yeah, that's familiar. That looks like me. I think we're then presenting the wreath at the grave of Alexander Hamilton. He's buried in Trinity Churchyard. as is Horatio Gates. Let me say a few things about Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates is buried there. Nobody knows where. They know he's there. The graves at Trinity Churchyard have been mixed up over the years, but he's there along with a lot of other patriots. I mean, Francis Lewis is known. John Lamb is known, who was the head of the artillery that Hamilton served under. Anyway, Horatio Gates was a part of the army in England. When his career was going nowhere, he sold his commission as a major and came to the United States. When the war broke out, he joined the cause and was appointed a major general. He started out as an adjutant to George Washington. He was very efficient in military organization. He got along well with the militia. After Fort Ticonderoga, let's go back to the plan of John Burgoyne. He had a plan. He replaced Guy Carleton as head of the British in Canada. He had a plan where he would come down through Lake Champlain and Lake George to Ticonderoga to Albany and meet up with General Howe coming from the south and General Saint-Leger coming from the west. The Americans would be split along the Hudson. The North states would be divided from the South states, and the British would control the situation. Like most plans, it didn't work out. For one thing, Howe decided to go to Pennsylvania and Philadelphia instead of coming up to help him. Second, Saint-Leger was not successful going west. He ran amok at Fort Stanwix, which the Americans defended. When Benedict Arnold showed up with a relief force, his Indian allies scattered because of that, and also because of a raid that Marinus Willis had conducted. So Burgoyne was left without much assistance. And the Americans, I think, sensing that they had a winning proposition, kept accumulating. By the end of the battle, the Americans outnumbered the British nearly 2-1. But on this occasion, Gates did a wonderful job of administering and collecting all of these people and having them work together. For that victory, he was awarded the gold medal by Congress, considered to be the hero of Saratoga. The downside of that was that he was supported by a faction which wanted him to replace George Washington. That didn't work out. So there are a lot of politics. Also, he was not a friend of a rival of Philip Schuyler, who was Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. They didn't get along very well. But on this one occasion, this was his shining moment. And this was considered by many people to be the absolute turning point of the war. And I want to point one thing out. There are stories about the animosity between Benedict Arnold, who played a heroic role at Saratoga, and Horatio Gates. And subsequently, most of the earlier stories of animosity were based on the memoirs and reports of James Wilkinson, who was Gates's assistant and who is described as Theodore Roosevelt as the greatest scoundrel in American history. He was a guy who was on the Spanish payroll while he was supposedly a general in the American Army. I won't go on and on about James Wilkinson. And I guess in his report to Congress, he substituted his name for other generals to give himself a more heroic appearance. And in fact, he was involved with Aaron Burr's scheme to, for which he was tried for treason, but Burr couldn't be convicted because Wilkinson was so unconvincing as a witness. So it turns out he was unconvincing about Arnold and Gates being at odds. There were two battles of Saratoga. One was Freeman's Farm, which took place on September 19th, where the riflemen of Daniel Morgan attacked the British and, drove them back. One of the German regiments managed to support the British. the British held the field, but they lost twice as many people as the Americans did, and were certainly leery of attacking them. Later on September 7th, the British commenced a reconnaissance in force, were met again by Daniel Morgan. Arnold had been replaced by Benjamin Lincoln, who had been released from captivity and outranked Arnold. So he took over Arnold's position there. During the battle, I guess Arnold requested for the authority to go help lead the troops there. And Gates agreed, according to Lincoln's aide, from letters, contemporary letters there. So the feud between the two of them and the disagreements were based on Wilkinson's memoirs, which are anything but convincing. Anyway, we had a presentation this last year by Eric Schnitzer, who's the leading historian at the Saratoga National Battlefield. And, so more and more information comes out. I had a remark here earlier that we don't learn much history in school. We have to continually learn about it. But even after we've learned it, we have not learned it all. Most of what we know of history is what people have written down. Not everybody writes things down. Things that are written down appear later. Letters come out of people's attics. History is a little bit like science. We keep revising it. All history is sort of revisionist history. We make our conclusions based on the evidence that we have, and the evidence keeps changing over time. Anyway, this is a fascinating thing. Horatio Gates was also a general at the Battle of Camden, which was one of America's worst defeats, and his military reputation suffered as a result. At the end of the war, I think he somewhat redeemed himself by a couple of ways. One, he helped support indigent American soldiers. American soldiers mostly didn't get paid. At the end of the war, they were given notes. They were given script, which they had to sell off, usually at deep discounts or 10 or 20%. So, they risked their lives, starved, froze, got shot at, and didn't get paid very much. The Army consisted mostly of poor men, not well-to-do guys who were looking for adventure, fortune, and whatnot, as opposed to the militia, which came and went. And after the war, a lot of these guys needed help, and Gates was among those who helped them. He was a vice president of the Society of the Cincinnati, which was formed by the officers to, there again, keep alive the memories and history of the Revolution. And he manumitted his slaves, which no other general, during his lifetime, which no other general did, which no other American general did. So, this is a fellow with a very mixed history, but he rose to the occasion at Saratoga, which could be said to be one of the most crucial moments of the American Revolution. Now I want to turn this over to, do we have more here? Oh, here we go. Look at this. This is us at Trinity Churchyard, one of the earlier assemblies here. We'll do that. What was this, St. Paul's? This is St. Paul's? All right, St. Paul's Churchyard. Yeah. All right, excellent. You guys. See a couple of you guys here too. Thank you. There we go. When again at St. Paul's. All right, so this was, well, it's 2012. Is this the ceremony where they recognized? Yeah, we put up a plaque for Horatio Gates. There is kind of a common grave for officers of the American Revolution on which he's listed, but there had been nothing in particular noting Horatio Gates individually. There is a plaque on there's a place where he lived called Rose Hill, which is at 24th Street and 2nd Avenue. However, the plaque, while noting it was where Horatio Gates lived, mostly made the point that Lafayette had visited him there. So it's more about Lafayette than General Gates. But he was a resident of New York City. He was active in the Republican Party. The Republican Party then is not the Republican Party now, as you probably know. And okay, so we got there here. Here we go, Horatio Gates. And here I am talking about Horatio Gates before. All right, way to go, Horatio. And this is as we've seen, this is buried, as I said, in an unmarked grave. A lot of the graves are just mixed together at Trinity Churchyard. He was the man in charge. Surrender Burgoyne. And this is what, the Battle of Bemis Heights. This is off the plan of. All right. So after the Battle of Bemis Heights, the Americans captured 2 of the redoubts, and the British position became untenable. It took Burgoyne 10 days actually to surrender. He dithered, and as he dithered, he became surrounded by more and more people. He had a chance to escape. He didn't, but fortunately, he was indecisive and ended up in a worse position 10 days later than he'd been right after the Battle of Bemis Heights. But they were out of food. They had no support. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1 at that point. But it was an amazing organizing effort. So more the Battle of Saratoga. And this is the surrenders, they say. And I guess this is part of the what's left of it, the part of the countryside. So we are up now to Marinus Willett, who also received a good. We have John.
General Gates refused to accept
Oh, I think this was a matter of courtesy of an officer of the army to which he used to belong. I mean, I think a lot of people felt that Gates was too gentle with Burgoyne, given the overwhelming position that the Americans occupied then. And they treated it as kind of a gentleman's agreement that they called this, they wouldn't even call it a surrender, they called it a convention. And the provisions of this convention were that the soldiers would be allowed to return to England on the promise that they wouldn't come back and fight. And as I said, Congress would have none of it. They overrode that and said, you know, you've got them, they're your prisoners, and they're going to stay our prisoners. So yeah, that was, and Gates was obviously criticized by Congress, you know, for that. Anyway, let's get on to, as part of this, you know, one of the reasons that the Americans were successful at Saratoga was that prior to the battles at Saratoga, there was a Battle of Bennington, where the British lost a lot of people, and the Battle of Fort Stanwix, where the relief was deterred from coming, which Jim will talk about.
Okay. By the way, Abby is listed in the program as it happened here. I think we'll get to you, Abby.
Speak into the microphone.
Okay, Abby is listed as it happened. Can you hear me? Wait. Here, does this work? Okay. Abby, I think we'll get to you before the Vigneron Award about it happened here. But in any event, by the way, I believe that Gates was did not accept the sword because he had a keen understanding. He was an Englishman, and he had a keen by birth, and he had a keen understanding of the politics of the American Revolution in England. And he knew that if he gave a lenient treatment to the British soldiers, that would go over very well in England, in contrast to the English who had burned the city of Kingston the week before. But let me go on to Marinus Willett. Marinus Willett is probably the least well-known of the 3 great generals that were buried in Trinity Churchyard. There's Alexander Hamilton, who you've all heard of, and Elizabeth is going to talk about. There's Gates, who really as a result of, I think, our organization and the DAR, we were the ones who got his grave marked after 200 years, being in an unmarked grave at this ceremony really stems from that marking by the DAR in 2012. Before that, there was no marker to him, even though his grave was there. But let me talk about Marinus Willet's grave is marked in Trinity Churchyard. And unfortunately, in many respects, he's the least well-known of the three great generals. But I think he's equally as important. Willett was actually one of the only ones who was born here in New York City. He first came to prominence here on Broad Street. There's a plaque to him, which very few people know. On June 6, 1775, as the war had just started in Bunker Hill, and there was a train of British troops who were taking the armaments, the heavy armaments, up to fight at Bunker Hill. Now, there had been a dispute among the people who were running New York between the Patriots and the British, and Willett jumped out in front of this line of armed British troops and said, "You're not allowed to take the heavy arms up to Boston. You can only take the light arms." And then a bunch of people started from the Sons of the Revolution, jumped out of the bars, and there was a confrontation right here on Broad Street, if you look at 60 Broad Street. And ultimately, the British, not wanting to repeat the Boston Massacre, had backed off. So the British only took the light arms up to. But as a result of that, Willett became kind of a patriot hero, which he wasn't before then. He was previously an officer of the British in the French and Indian War, and he got appointed a colonel in the American Army in the New York militia. He fought, he saved the city of Peekskill. There's no march against being burned, but then his major status was he was a colonel in charge, second in command at the Fort Stanwix. Now, as Ambrose mentioned, General Burgoyne had plan was he would attack the American lines from the east, but he was stopped at Bennington. But his second plan was he would attack from the west at Fort Stanwix, and he had a very significant force under General Leger. And if Fort Stanwix, which was then controlled by the British, that's in Rome, New York, was fell, there's little doubt that Horatio Gates would have lost at Saratoga, because they would have been attacked from the west, and he would have been surrounded. So it was critical to keep Fort Stanwix, and there were only 700 American soldiers there and 1,500 British soldiers who were soon laying siege to it. And what happened was General Leger said to surrounded the fort, and he said, "You know, you guys, if you don't give up the fort, we have 1,000 Indian allies, and our allies are going to massacre your women and children. So I strongly suggest," and General Burgoyne has been successful at Saratoga already, "so I strongly suggest that you give up the fort." And so this was a kind of there were 700 men. It was under Peter Gansevoort, who was Herman Melville's grandfather, actually was in charge, but Willett was the older man, and he had Willett become the spokesman. And in the sheet that I left out, let me read to you what he said. With the approbation of Colonel Gansevoort, Colonel Willett made the following reply. Looking the important major, that's Major St. Leger, full in the face, he observed, "Do I understand you, sir? I think you say that you come from a British colonel who is commander of the army that invests this fort, and by your uniform you appear to be an officer in the British service." Remember, Willett had been an officer in the British service too. You have made a long speech on the occasion of your visit, which stripped of its superfluities amounts to this, that you come from a British colonel to the commandant of this garrison to tell him that if he does not deliver up the garrison into the hands of your colonel, he will send his Indians to murder our women and children. You will please to reflect, sir, that their blood will be on your hands, not ours. We are doing our duty. This garrison is committed to our charge, and we will take care of it. After you get out of it, you may turn around and look at the outside, but never expect to come again unless you come as a prisoner. I consider the message you have brought a degrading one for a British officer to send, and by no means reputable for a British officer to carry. For my own part, I declare that before I would consent to deliver this garrison to such a murdering set as your army, by your own account, consists of, I would suffer my body to be filled with splinters and set on fire, as you know has at times been practiced by such hordes of women and children killers as belong to your army. So that's what Willett said to the commanding British officer asking to do. They turned around, and it was far from clear that the siege wouldn't succeed, but ultimately Benedict Arnold came with a relief column, and the Fort Stanwix never fell. And as a result, St. Leger's army was not able to attack Gates at Saratoga from behind, and it was a critical part of the Battle of Saratoga. If you go up to Fort Stanwix, which I encourage you to do, it's in Rome, New York, they'll tell you it was the fort that never surrendered. So it was, so that act as the commanding officer and his speech to the British officer really made Willett known for the next 50 years as the hero of Fort Stanwix, and was of great political benefit to him. He later became the sheriff of New York City. He was very important in the post-war in New York. He was active in the Tammany Society and in the had a very important political position here in New York until the Federalists took over. But really, his greatest effect, in my opinion, was in 1790, when the United States government, which, by the way, operated out of this building, had a real problem right after the war, after the U.S. Constitution was enacted. In Alabama and Georgia, most of Alabama and Georgia was controlled by the Creek Indians. Now, the Creek Indians were not friends of the United States. They'd been allies of the British. And they said that any American who came into Alabama and Georgia was subject to being killed. So it wasn't like, even though by the Treaty of Paris, the United States was given land east of the Mississippi, the United States didn't control it. So, and the Georgia state government said we ought to send in the troops and throw them out. But the War Department, headed by Henry Knox and by George Washington, operating out of this building, knew that we didn't have the power to do that. We didn't have the forces to do that. The Creeks were very, very powerful. So they said, well, we've got to try to cut a deal with them. We've got to try to make a treaty with them. And they sent out Benjamin Lincoln. That didn't fail. And but then they knew that Marinus Willett, at the end of the Revolutionary War, had been active in the Northwest with Indians and had some rapport with them, they thought. So they asked Mr. Willett if he would lead a delegation to try to see if they could settle the Creek War. Willett, with a guide, snuck into the Indian territory and met with Alexander McGillivray, who was the Creek chief. That was a very dangerous mission because he could have been killed by the Creeks. But he convinced he stopped at Alexander McGillivray's headquarters and said, Mr. McGillivray, I represent the President of the United States, George Washington. We are friendly people. We want to make peace with you. Come visit us. You see that we'll be, we should work together. And the Creeks, who'd kind of been sold out by the British in the Treaty of Paris, agreed to send 27 Creek chiefs up here to the US Capitol, which was right here in New York. And they said, and then Willett, who was the head of something called the Tammany Society, kind of a civic organization, although somewhat political and later very political, but they would dress up in Indian headdresses, and they met them in force, and they had a fantastic, they had several meetings with them, and they had drinks, and they said, you know, we're all brothers under the skin. And little by little, the opposition or the skepticism of the Creeks faded away. So they were able to conclude a very fair treaty whereby the Creeks would retain their land, but Americans could go into it. The Creeks would give up certain property to the United States. Actually, the Creek chief, Mr. McGillivray, was given $100,000, although that was secret. But in any event, so they cut the Treaty of New York, which was a very important treaty and essentially secured for the United States the southeastern part of what today is Georgia and Alabama. And it is said that at the final meeting, they had toasts, so they said, and that McGillivray raised his glass and he said, I see you gentlemen call yourself the Tammany Society. Now, the Tammany Society would later be very important. I assume you know it was Chief Tammany of the Delawares who in 1683 signed the peace treaty with William Penn that formed the basis for the Pennsylvania colony and the city of Philadelphia. Chief Tammany firmly believed in peace between Native Americans and white men. And if Native Americans and white men could work together in peace and respect, their cities would be among the most important and wealthy in the world. It was for this reason that the city of Philadelphia became the most important city in the colonies, more so than other colonies, in which the wars became, in which there were no wars between our people. Although perhaps these principles were not always followed in Philadelphia, it was Chief Tammany's dream that one day there would be a city in which the government and people would more closely adhere to his vision, and that such a city would one day be the largest, wealthiest, and most important and powerful in the world. So they raised their glass to Chief Tammany and they said, we are, yes, Tammany's dream. Now, the Tammany Society actually would grow in importance in the elections of 1800 under General Gates, and they would defeat Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists. And for 160 years thereafter, the Tammany Society, through the Democratic Party, would rule the city. Now, it's often stained with corruption, but don't believe everything you read in the history books. The Tammany Society believed that men of different races and creeds should work together, and it believed in ethnic harmony. And it was for that reason, well, it wasn't until 1960, with the defeat of Carmine de Sapio, the great Tammany leader, that Tammany was forever banned. But by that time, the city of New York was one of the wealthiest and most important and powerful in the world. So I think this story of Chief Tammany is quite important, and Willett was at the center of it. Willett also afterwards became the mayor of New York in 1807. He was in 1812, when the city was threatened by British invasion. He walked up at the age of 72 to the steps of City Hall, and he rallied the populace to join the militia. And soon 20,000 people turned out of the militia, and the British never came once they saw the strength of the Union. Willett didn't die until 1831, when he was 91. And there were 10,000 people at his funeral. He was considered one of the leading, they said he was one of the leading figures in New York City. And after his long years of service, and they said he'd never be forgotten. But how many of you have ever heard of Marinus Willett till today? Thank you.
Oh. Okay, good, sure. Yeah, good, good. We'll go next up here. No. Okay, this is the Marinus Willett historic marker on Broad Street. It's a 60 Broad Street. 60 Broad. It's, you go in there, it's on the right side as you're walking in the door. Pretty prominent, but I'm sure nobody notices. All right, get to that. Jim's talk about Marinus Willett reminded me a couple of years ago, we had in our book award, we had two awardees talking about the Battle of Saratoga. And the first one said the Battle of Saratoga changed everything. It turned the American Revolution into a world war. It brought the French into the war. You know, the whole thing was transformed. And the second speaker got up and said, the Battle of Saratoga changed nothing. Because up in upstate New York, the Civil War in America went on. The Loyalists and the Patriots were still attacking each other. The Indians were, the Indian allies of the British were attacking people. And that went on for another couple of years, a few years and whatnot. So it sort of depends on where you draw your focus as to what conclusions you come to. But I was very amused by, you know, the complete contrast of these two authors. I want to introduce Elizabeth Kaplan, who will talk about Alexander Hamilton. There's a lot to say about Alexander Hamilton, but I think you can do the appropriate service to him. Oh, great.
First of all, I must say that I am not related to James Kaplan, although many people may think so. He has a lovely wife of his own, and my husband was an only child, so I know we're not related. Can you hear me? Please. Okay. Secondly, I want to compliment the beauty of the troops here today. I thought I had done my best to dress well, but there's no way I can equal you two young ladies and all the gentlemen with their fine uniforms. So thank you for doing that. Now, as to our hero, Alexander Hamilton. Early in his life, in his teens, he said, "Oh, I wish there were a war." He always wanted to excel in the public eye. He came from humble origins, as you probably know, and he thought that a war would be one way for him to elevate himself. And actually, that's what happened. He did come to the States, aided by funds from one of his mother's cousins to come for an education. He ended up at King's College, which is now Columbia University, as you know. And in 1775, as the revolutionary spirit was taking over in the city as well as everywhere else, he became part of a militia that he organized with the students at King's College. They managed to get some cannon that belonged to the British, and he became an artillery captain and exceeded at that. It wasn't long before George Washington became aware that this young man was a genius. He was a genius politically. He was a genius in a way militarily, not a genius socially, as we can find out later, and I will not discuss that. However, there was George Washington in need of an aide-de-camp. And although Hamilton at this point wanted to be in the battle on the field to bring glory to himself, he did agree to be an aide-de-camp to George Washington for quite a while. Until 1781, they had a little bit of a dispute that many of you know of, and he quit, but then was asked by Washington to come back as the French troops and the American troops were about to march down south to Yorktown, and he took a commission as a lieutenant colonel. Alongside him was Lafayette, who was also commissioned in the French army. And the two of them together had known each other before and were happy to work together. But at the Battle of Yorktown, Hamilton's ego, Hamilton's desire to bring glory to himself, as well as to his country, as well as to his unit, he wanted to be in charge of what was going to happen on the redoubts at Yorktown. And so I'm going to quote from you from a book I recommend highly. It's by Nathaniel Philbrick, In the Hurricane Eye, The Genius of George Washington and the Victory at Yorktown. But there is a chapter, well, I would say half of a chapter, maybe 6 paragraphs, that describe in great detail how Hamilton behaved at the Battle of Yorktown. By the way, he did win, which is a good thing. So Colonel Alexander Hamilton led the battalion of light infantry in the opening of the trenches, a tradition associated with the siege. Having spent most of the war as an aide to GW, the ambitious Hamilton was intent on winning as much glory as possible in what might be the last significant action of the war. That morning, Hamilton made sure that at least for a few minutes, his troops were the center of everyone's attention. Even though it placed them directly in the line of fire, he ordered his men up onto the ramparts, where in full view of the astonished enemy, who temporarily ceased firing, they performed a series of evolutions known as the Manual of Arms, a gratuitous act of bravery. Captain James Duncan wrote, quote, "Although I esteem him one of the first officers of the American Army, I must beg in this instance to think he wantonly exposed the lives of his men," unquote. It would not be the last time. Hamilton made a point of placing himself and his men in harm's way. October 14th, 1781, much to the frustration of Alexander Hamilton, Lafayette, who was his senior under Washington's command, chose a fellow Frenchman, Lieutenant Colonel de Gimont, to lead the attack on Redoubt, a British fortification number 10 on the right. Hamilton, who outranked the French lieutenant colonel, was not about to let this chance for glory slip through his fingers. Even though he considered Lafayette a friend, he decided to appeal directly to George Washington. For 4 years, these two men had worked side by side, with Hamilton becoming not just an aide, but the written voice of his commander. By awarding Hamilton his current position at the head of the light infantry, Washington had proven capable of rising above their past differences. But to request them to overrule Lafayette, who enjoyed a personal relationship with his commander that no officer could match, was in all likelihood asking the impossible. To Hamilton's surprise and ultimate delight, GW decided in his favor. "We have it," Hamilton gleefully announced to his friend Nicholas Fish on returning to the tent the two officers shared. While Hamilton led the assault on the British redoubt, his other good friend and former aide to George Washington, John Loren, would command a small group of soldiers. Hamilton led the way over the abattis. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. It is a French word. It's the maze of tree trunks that have been sharpened. You saw a picture of that before. Hamilton led the way over the abattis and protecting the British redoubt, using the back of one of the men to vault himself onto the parapet. With him was Captain Stephen Olney, carrying a long pole with a sharp blade at the end. Hamilton made sure that none of his men stooped to the level of Benedict Arnold's soldiers in Connecticut at Fort Grinwald, where they killed American militiamen who wanted to surrender. No, he was incapable of imitating examples of barbarity and forgetting recent provocations. He asked his soldiers to spare the lives of every man who ceased to resist. This one really surprised me when I read it. You've heard of General Henry Knox, who eventually became quite important in the cabinet, but was in charge of the artillery during the Revolution. Knox and Hamilton were standing in redoubt number 10 when shells came toward them. Hamilton placed the wider Knox, he was quite a fat man, as a breastwork, wrote Henry Knox later, between him and the shells. And the two men struggled a bit. The shells exploded, but did not harm them. Henry Knox was standing in redoubt number 10 with Hamilton too. Washington had recently instituted an order requiring the men in the trenches to shout out a warning when they saw an enemy shell headed in their direction. Hamilton, the excitable romantic, felt the order was unsoldierly. Knox, the more even-tempered pragmatist, thought it made sense. When a shell landed in the redoubt, both Hamilton and Knox ran as quickly as possible for cover, with Hamilton making sure to put Knox between him and the explosions. Knox said he was used as a breastwork. Knox gathered Hamilton and threw him toward the shell. Brushing the dirt from his uniform, Knox turned to Hamilton and smiled. "Now, what do you think, Hamilton, about crying shell?" Hamilton's skills and performance as an artillery captain meant he was quickly promoted to principal aide-de-camp to General Washington again. It's fair to call theirs one of the most significant partnerships in all of American history. They both went on together to form our Constitution, our government, and lead us to many, many successes. But I thought this insight about Hamilton, using his military experience to elevate him in the eyes of as many people as possible, is significant. So I want to thank you for listening carefully. I want to thank John Herzog of the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society for inviting me to speak. And I hope, John, I didn't speak out of turn in casting a light on our mutual hero. Thank you.
A couple of these. We have, this is a memorial to Mr. Alexander Hamilton. Here is a copy of the surrender at Yorktown. We have in our the wallpaper in the executive office building picture of Cornwallis surrendering to Washington. In fact, Cornwallis was indisposed and didn't show up at the surrender, so General O'Hara surrendered instead. They offered to surrender to Comte de Rochambeau. Rochambeau said nope, surrender to Washington. Washington said nope, surrender to General Benjamin Lincoln, my second in command. You're the second in command, so you will surrender to him. I guess this is the map of Yorktown. You see a lot of ships there in the harbor. Those are French ships. And the fact that the English were bottled up completed the effectiveness of the siege. I guess you can see the cannons there, the artillery and whatnot to the north at that point. Here we have a picture as Elizabeth has described it, the assault on redoubt number 10. This was done with bayonets to avoid alerting the soldiers. I think the French attacking number 9 did use muskets, and they suffered greater casualties. The Americans benefited from surprise on that. You have George Washington, his hand on a cannon. This is not one of the French cannons. He would have to raise his hand over his head to get on those. Those are tremendous. Well, here we go. Yes, surrender of George Lord Cornwallis Lord Cornwallis wasn't there, but in spirit, I guess he was there. And these are a picture of the evities that Elizabeth described here. What am I doing here? Why is Microsoft interrupting my slide? There we go. Okay. So yeah, this is what the Americans had to get through and over and whatnot, typical of a defense of these positions. Men were sent out earlier to hack away at these things and open paths for the other soldiers to climb through. This has been recreated at Yorktown, the position there. I don't know if we any further. This is, but I will mention, we'll get to Stephen Rochefontaine was one of the French engineers who helped one of the many. It was at a celebration of the Society of the Cincinnati in Fraunces Tavern, which is actually the next building. But in the tavern, they were celebrating the 4th of July with Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And the story was that Alexander Hamilton was in a jovial mood and very celebratory, and Aaron Burr was very grim at the time. A week later, they had a duel and Alexander Hamilton was killed. But that's one of the events that happened here, the Society of the Cincinnati meeting to celebrate the 4th of July. They were both members of that organization. So I don't know if that was, I think they, apart from their military associations, they had arranged to duel in New Jersey because it was illegal in New York. We're very privileged today to have French soldiers, past and future, with us. As I said, it was a enlightenment to me to discover the extent to which the French supported the American cause during the American Revolution. And part of it was just the enemy of my enemy is my friend. There were some people that philosophically supported the American Revolution, but the bottom line is that without the French support, the American Revolution would not have succeeded. I mean, probably not, most likely not. The support was absolutely enormous on a number of respects. When I was at the National Park at Yorktown, I asked the guide, what experience did George Washington have in siege warfare? I mean, the answer is basically none. What experience did Rochambeau have in siege warfare? Extensive, so added to the money, the munitions, the Navy, the soldiers, was also the expertise. I'd like to call upon, we're very privileged tonight to have a young cadet from West Point. I mean, I'd love to hear her remarks about West Point. Each year we give the Knox Trophy to the leading cadet in military studies there. We used to claim it was the oldest award at West Point. Turns out it's the second oldest. The oldest award is to the Athlete of the Year, something, an internal award. We're the first external award. Now there are about 80 awards that are given there. So we're very proud of doing this, named after General Knox. Anyway, I'd like to call on Camille Letournel to address us now. Thank you.
Mesdames, Messieurs, cette année, nous avons célébré le 80e anniversaire du débarquement de Normandie, un moment crucial de notre histoire commune. Nous avons rendu hommage aux soldats américains qui ont pris d'assaut les plages de Normandie ce 6 juin 1944 pour libérer la France de l'emprise de la tyrannie nazie. Reconnaissons-le, à cette période précise, la France doit sa survie aux États-Unis. Nous sommes à présent réunis pour commémorer un autre temps fort de l'histoire commune de la France et des États-Unis, l'engagement français aux côtés de l'armée du général George Washington lors de la guerre d'indépendance américaine. écrivant donc dans les annales de l'histoire la célèbre bataille de Yorktown, en Virginie, par laquelle les États-Unis doivent la vie à la France. Il y a plus de 2 siècles, alors que le destin de cette jeune nation était en jeu, le roi de France, Louis XVI, a répondu à l'appel du général George Washington pour lutter contre le règne de la couronne britannique sur les 13 colonies américaines révoltées. La contribution militaire française n'a jamais été aussi décisive que lors de la bataille de Yorktown, se déroulant du 28 septembre au 19 octobre 1781. Préparée par le comte de Rochambeau et le général George Washington, la campagne de Yorktown combine un assaut des forces terrestres et navales contre les troupes britanniques commandées par le général Charles Cornwallis. Après la célèbre bataille de Chesapeake du 5 au 8 septembre, au cours de laquelle l'escadre de l'amiral français de Grasse met en déroute la flotte britannique, le général Cornwallis se retrouve pris au piège sur la péninsule de Yorktown. Les forces alliées franco-américaines, alors fortes de 17 000 hommes, dont près de 10 000 Français, et les 6 500 hommes de la division américaine de Virginie sous le commandement du général Lafayette, appuyés par une logistique exclusivement militaire, déclenchent, le 28 septembre, les hostilités contre une armée britannique forte de 8 000 hommes. Les forces franco-américaines repoussent l'armée britannique retranchée à Yorktown. Coupée de sa base arrière par l'armada impressionnante de l'amiral de Grasse, terrassée de nuit et de jour par les feux de la redoutable artillerie française, l'armée de la Couronne capitule le 19 octobre 1781. Cette défaite force les Britanniques à entamer des négociations pour la paix qui les conduiront à la reconnaissance de l'indépendance américaine. Le premier chapitre de l'histoire moderne des États-Unis s'écrit à Yorktown. Nos ancêtres l'ont écrit ensemble. Le pacte d'amitié franco-américain, scellé à Yorktown, a depuis toujours été respecté. C'est au nom des mêmes principes d'indépendance et de liberté que des soldats américains ont donné leur vie en Picardie, en Champagne ou encore en Normandie près d'un siècle et demi plus tard. L'héritage de Lafayette vit à travers notre engagement commun de défense des principes et de liberté. À tous ceux qui ont combattu pour cette liberté si chère, à ceux qui ont sacrifié leur vie pour nos idéaux, nous rendons hommage. Merci beaucoup.
And I will give a translation of,
Microphone.
oh, sorry. A translation of Second Lieutenant Letournel's address. This year, we celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Allied landing in Normandy, a time that was really crucial in our common history. We paid homage to the American soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The aim of liberating France from Nazi tyranny. At that time, it can be said that France owed her liberation to the United States. We are here today to commemorate another time, another turning point in the history of our nations, when France intervened in the war, in the Revolutionary War, alongside General Washington during the Revolutionary War. In a sense, one could say that the United States owed a liberation at that time to France. The Battle of Yorktown took place 4 years after the Battle of Saratoga, the first major victory by American forces, which helped make the decision, melt the French government to decide to intervene. The military contribution was particularly decisive in the Battle of Yorktown, where artillery played an important part. The battle took place from December 28 to October 19, 1781. And the battle was planned by General Rochambeau and General George Washington in a campaign against the troops commanded by General Cornwallis. After the the naval battle of the Chesapeake, the Battle of the Capes, in which the French fleet commanded by Admiral de Grasse routed the British ships. General Cornwallis was then trapped in the Yorktown Peninsula. The French allied, the Franco-American forces totaled 17,000, which included 10,000 French troops and 605,000 American troops from Virginia and commanded by Lafayette, with strong logistic support from France. On September 28th, the battle commenced, and with the British commanding a force with the British side, numbering between 8,000 and 9,000 troops, British and German mostly. As Cornwallis was cut off from his bases, and the French fleet blockaded access, the British surrendered on October 19, 1781. This was the first chapter in the modern history of the United States, and the bonds of friendship between France and the United States have prevailed since, through many turmoil in history. The all right. American troops intervened again to save France in the First World War, when American soldiers died in Picardy and Champagne, and again in the Second World War, in the battlefields of Normandy, northern France, and Germany. The common history of the United States and France illustrate a commitment on the part of both nations, to freedom and independence.
This is the final part of our ceremony this year, but we have a new thing, which is the inauguration of the Frederic P. Vigneron Award. By the way, before that, Abby, do you want to say anything about it happened here? Come on. Okay. Okay, this is Abby Suckle, who is organizing and leading our effort to have it happened here, which is right here, for July 4th, 2025. Is that
Okay.
correct? Yeah, sure, go on.
Hi, okay, what it happened here is, as you know, this happens to be the 400th anniversary of New York City's history is 2025. It's actually not the exact correct year, but one of the mayors changed it a long time ago, so it would have been 1624. However, it is also the 250th anniversary of America, which is in 2026. Every city in America is going to have some celebration. So we decided, as the Lower Manhattan Historic Association and Culture Now, because New York was the first as a capital of our country, and we thought that America actually starts here and it starts in New York. So we would combine both of these celebratory events and have a special event called It Happened Here. There are over 1,000 historical events that actually happened in Lower Manhattan, and they're not that far apart. If you do walk around the city, what you're going to see is lots of plaques. And the graves, this is just a small portion of what is surrounding us. So we thought we could compress New York City and America's history as it impacts us into a 5-day celebration on July 4th, 2025. And so the first day will be the 1600s, July 4th will be the 1700s. Just to whet your appetite, we got a confirmation yesterday from the United States Southern federal courts, where they're going to do a naturalization ceremony of new Americans on July 4th next year on the steps of Federal Hall. So hopefully, and as you know, we have our parade, and we also have an afternoon at Fraunces Tavern, and we will be doing some really extraordinary celebration that day next year. So please put it in your calendar. And ladies, please come back and give us the next chapter in the French. Perhaps we can find something really special to do next year for you. So hopefully you'll put it in your calendar. And also we welcome anybody and everybody to be a partnering organization. We're actually going to do a fundraiser, which is going to be January 9th at the WSA space on Water Street, which is the office building of the future. And they have workspaces, they have maker spaces, then they have an in-house bartender and Beyonce's hairdresser. So it should be a lot of fun. We're doing the history of the New York cocktail. It'll be a cocktail hour with oysters.
Okay, let me bring to the final part of our program, but also a new part of our program, which is the Frederic P. Vigneron Award. Lane, you want to come up? Now, Frederic P. Vigneron, for those of you who don't know, was a member of our board. He died suddenly, but he was an indefatigable promoter of French-American history and really was the one who would organize this Saratoga Yorktown celebration. I first met him at when we had our first July 4th parade from the Hermione to Bowling Green, then Bowling Green, now Evacuation Day Plaza. And we were all pretty excited about that. And we had a number of speakers. And then out of the crowd, a guy came up and said, you know, I'm a colonel in the French Air Force, and I would like to speak. And I said, okay, or we said, okay. And it turned out that, and he gave this very eloquent speech about not only was the French and Americans worked together in the time of Lafayette and in the time of the Battle of Saratoga, but also we're working now in Afghanistan and other places, and that there was still a collaboration between the French and American. And he later became part of our board. He had both, I believe, a French mother. Was his mother? His French mother, a French father, and an American mother. And he was totally, at the time, I still to this day don't know why a colonel in the French Air Force was living here in New York City. And I don't know if he ever flew a plane. He later discovered that he was in the financial industry in his late 50s, which, you know, isn't always the best time for people in the financial industry. But on that day, he had a new career. And his career was as a tremendous promoter of French American history. of this organization's efforts to have the Saratoga Yorktown celebration. And he was the one who would organize it. He also wanted to have, got the French war veterans here. And he got he wanted to have the students from the Lycée Francais. But he would have been the one who had been organizing this ceremony today. Unfortunately, he died suddenly about 2 years ago. 2 years ago. But I think, as perhaps Shakespeare said, sometimes the good that men do dies with their bones. But I believe in part the purpose of the award is that the good that Fred Vigneron did as in promoting the French-American history and in promoting this event and other events of this type. I'm sorry that he wasn't here to see the great Lafayette celebrations that we had in New York. But we're going to try to give this award every year. And this year, we're going to give it to the French war veterans. Now, where's the plaque? The plaque? I'm sorry. Oh, this is it. Okay. Okay. Ling, come back. Here, I want you to award give the award to Mr. Dupuis. Ling was his longtime companion, and so Mr. Dupuis. Okay. Yeah.
Photo.
Okay. Here. Yeah, Ling,
So on behalf of the French War veterans and the American Society of the Souvenir Francais, thank you, Jim, and thank you to the Lower Manhattan Historical Association, Sons of the Revolution in the State of New York, Fraunces Tavern Museum, and the cultureNOW for this incredible honor. I am truly humbled to accept this inauguration award. This recognition reflects the enduring collaboration and friendship between France and America over the centuries. Together, we have embraced challenges and celebrated success. I am excited about what we'll achieve together in the future. Thank you all.